We are IJLSA, also known as the International Justice League of Super Acquaintances, and our members are Kevin Byrne, Adam Hayward, Julie Lee, Kira LaRue, and Drew Salazar. First, let's take a look at the basics of our cognitive agent. Our task was to design a program that could choose a restaurant at which to enjoy a meal by taking a large amount of complex input, such as personality traits, past experience, routine, as well as restaurant type, location, price, and etc. All of this was to be done in a manner simulating that of a person. We first chose to look at the individual and their decision-making processes before determining how those processes would differ in a social dynamic. We hypothesized that cravings would oftentimes have some sort of impact on an individual or group's final decision. People often experience cravings or a feeling of unrelenting necessity to eat a specific kind of dish from a specific kind of restaurant. For example, a student may experience a craving for a milkshake after observing someone else enjoying one. Throughout our project, we observed many different occasions of cognitive bias. We observed variance in decision-making from person to person. This usually was caused by some sort of difference in personality or experience. We also noticed different forms of social influence. Some people were more assertive than others in group situations. Lastly, we observed variations in individual motivation, which oftentimes led to different outcomes in group decision-making.
Now we're going to be talking about the background to our cognitive agent and the interview data we gathered. From our literature reviews, there were 4 main aspects of decision-making that stood out to us. One being perceived competency of peers, which speaks about how often in group decisions, people try to weigh every input on decision-making equally, which can actually be damaging. Group members should actually be encouraged to weigh competence of individual opinions and reliability in the given area and consider this when making a decision. At its base, this idea is implying that equality biases can actually impede successful or preferable decision-making. Second, we have available cognitive energy, which shows how variance in everyday decision-making outcomes are mostly explained by decision-making styles. Quality of decision-making also includes cognitive processes used with regulating decision-making, as in the amount of cognitive resources that must be utilized to make a decision, and whether it's seen as being worth said resources. Next, we have the presence of uncertainty. So uncertainty plays a large role in decision-making. In order to accurately imitate cognition, a formulation of uncertainty should be used. This moves the focus of cognition in decision-making from optimality or rationality to accuracy found in the presence of uncertainty. Finally, we have recognition. This paper centers around the idea or heuristic that if one of 2 objects is recognized and the other is not, then infer that the recognized object has the higher value. When given the choice to choose between 2 things, like which one is greater in value, the chooser will pick the one that they recognize given they only recognize one. For our interview data, we found a few key responses that were consistent. For one, cravings turned out to take a large role in choosing a restaurant. It takes little cognitive processing and is easy to follow when present, so it often is, based on our interview data. When group conflict arose in decision-making, people tended to defer to the group. This comes second, of course, to the situation when a craving is present and the craving is forced upon the group. If they did not defer to the group, they might choose to meet up after picking up dinner, in which case it is once again an individual decision. Finally, the situation of dating had an effect on choosing a restaurant. Typically, dates cause people to drop their normal decision-making strategies and be more adventurous or pricey, which evidently will change the outcome even if it's the same person making the decision.
Now on to the agent itself. The overarching goal of our agent is simply to model a human conversation that ends up with a restaurant being chosen to go eat at. More specifically, and in terms of this class, other goals we had were to have the agent learn over time, both in terms of people learning about each other and the world they live in, be able to coherently explain why it made certain decisions and how it got to the final output, and finally to accomplish all of this in a distributed fashion where no central entity was doing all of the logic and processing. The architecture of our system is based upon certain Java classes that are required, and then there are many more classes underneath those that support it. The most important classes are conversation, people, restaurants, and strategies. Meta people is also important, but that is just another use of the same person class. Restaurant is obvious that it just represents the attributes of a restaurant. Strategies are used to enable a person to decide if a restaurant is acceptable or not, and we have 10 different subclasses of this to account for all of the strategies people talked about during our interviews. Conversation is simply a way to maintain temporary state in between each verbal exchange, but no logic is performed. People is the most important class where suggesting, evaluating, and learning all take place. A meta-person is just the bare-bones internal model someone has about the person they're interacting with that slowly becomes more sophisticated over time. We also have an executive schema that holds the main while loop that allows our program to run at all. Now onto the demo. Our agent is a CLI program that takes minimal input and shows progress through print statements. We'll now run through a few days of conversation to show the process. As you can see, each of them are going back and forth, suggesting certain restaurants, and then they're both rejecting them if they do not like them, and it shows why they reject them based on certain strategies. And if they cannot come to a consensus, they will lower their standards until they finally agree on a certain restaurant. And as you can see, Carlton here learned from Mark's rejection that he used his rating strategy here, and he added that to the internal model of the other person's preferences. And then Mark here learned about the strategy of Carlton with his service strategy. Neither of them actually considered them in this run, but in future runs you'll see that they consider them. And then here at the bottom you see that they both learned about certain restaurants while they're out to eat. And then in the following run of the program, you see they both are suggesting them. And then here, before Carlton suggests a new restaurant, he actually considers the rating strategy because he knows this about Mark, that he has a certain minimum threshold for the rating of a restaurant before he will want to go there. And then they go and he suggests it, but then still Mark rejected it. And he'll go and finally they agree on something. And see, last time it took them 7 times to agree, this time it only took them 4. And they still learn certain restaurants. Another run at a time. And then here you can see Carlton actually considered the dislike strategy before it again. And then because he considered it and he suggested this one based on that consideration, Mark agreed on it because it was likely that they would know on it. They would both agree. And then you can see after a few runs, I'm just going through a bunch of them, you'll eventually see that here the program noted that they actually went to a restaurant, one of the previous ones they learned about while they were out. Because all the previous ones were restaurants they already knew about going in prior to the program execution, but here he suggested one that they learned about. And then if you run it enough times, sometimes that they both have too few restaurants to actually suggest that they won't come to a consensus at all, and they just actually don't go out to eat. See there, when we just passed, it says Carlton has no suggestion. And because they both ran out of suitable restaurants that they would like to go to, they just didn't go anywhere because they couldn't decide on anywhere to go. And it says try again tomorrow. Then the following day, they learned about more restaurants, and then here they continued to suggest them, and then they were able to finally agree. And then if you eventually want to end the program, you just say no, and it'll tell you how many days you ran through there. It was 33 iterations of the program. As you saw from the demo, both people went back and forth suggesting things until they both agreed or they lowered their standards until there was an acceptable result. It would also print out which strategies each person used every time they evaluated a suggested restaurant. They each learned about the other person and the strategies the other employs. They would then also learn about restaurants while they're out eating. State is maintained across days, and both participants slowly learn all of the preferences of the other person. Since human memory is fallible, they don't always learn right away, and even once they learn, they will occasionally forget to consider their internal model before suggesting a restaurant. But when they do apply these learned strategies, they are more likely to agree on a restaurant in fewer iterations. The program also notes when a restaurant is agreed upon that was one of the results that they learned while they were out to eat rather than one they already knew about prior to.
And finally, the conclusion. Focusing on our project on choosing a restaurant helped us learn about our main cognitive science key finding, in which this case was cognitive bias. Cognitive bias played a significant role within our project in 3 different ways. In a first way, cognitive bias within decision making was evident because differences exist within an individual's decision making process. For example, we learned from our interviews that people have their own different viewpoints in what they consider a restaurant, and these different viewpoints would often impact the way they would decide on choosing a specific restaurant to go to over another. In the second way, social influence was also pretty evident, especially within a group of people. Some interviewees mentioned how when they are in a group of people when deciding to go to a restaurant, they tend to go along with the majority vote. This shows that social influence had an impact on their overall decision-making process because they were with a group of other people. And finally, the third way deals with individual motivations. Our interviewees also mentioned that their personal preferences in a restaurant also play a big role in choosing a restaurant to go to over another, such as looking at factors whether the restaurant is good at serving food quickly, whether the location is convenient to them, whether the restaurant has good service, or also serves food that they are currently craving at the moment, and etc.